The slap heard through first class. The sound came suddenly loud and sharp, like the crack of lightning in a quiet sky, and for a split-second time froze inside the luxurious first-class cabin, the kind of space where silence and order rule every moment, the kind of place where crying babies are met with side glances and laughter, is often measured. The little boy, who had been giggling just seconds ago, now stood completely still next to seat 2A, with a small red mark blooming on his left cheek, his tiny hand clutching the leather armrest, while his blue dinosaur toy lay forgotten on the carpeted floor. The woman towering over him wore a perfectly ironed uniform, her airline-issued name tag slightly tilted from the sudden movement. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as the realization of what she had done began to crash through her like a wave of ice. Passengers nearby gasped all at once. The businessman reading the Financial Times lowered his paper. The elderly woman in seat 1C clutched her pearls and leaned forward with a shocked whisper, and even the teenage girl with headphones paused her music to glance around. Her lips slightly parted. The moment was heavy, frozen. The stewardess, known as Harper among her crew, blinked. As if waking up from a bad dream, she stared at her hand, still tingling from the slap, and then looked at the child in front of her. She expected tears, but none came. The boy just stared up at her, his eyes huge and stunned, as if the world had flipped upside down. She forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, bent down and whispered, "I am so sorry, sweetheart. You startled me. You were climbing the seat, and I didn't see you. I thought you were about to fall, that's all." But her voice shook, and her hands trembled as she reached to pick up the toy, her fingers brushing against the carpet as if trying to erase the moment from existence. The boy didn't respond. He simply sat down mechanically in his seat, eyes distant, his tiny hands wrapping around his stuffed dinosaur as if it were the only thing he trusted now. The murmurs started then, subtle at first, like a quiet breeze building into a storm. Someone whispered, "Did she just slap a child?" Another voice, louder, said that boys alone who hits a child in first class for being playful. Harper stood up quickly, straightening her posture, trying to regain control of the situation. The cabin crew's worst nightmare was unfolding right in front of her, and she had no idea how to stop it. She scanned the faces watching her, some angry, some stunned, some already reaching for their phones. Her heart pounded harder with every second as she backed away toward the galley, her mind racing through the morning briefing, where they had mentioned a VIP unaccompanied minor traveling in first class. His name was Mason Blackwell. His age was just 4 years old, and he was traveling with no guardian, but was under strict instruction to be cared for with top priority. That last name, Blackwell, hit her like a punch in the gut, because there was only one Blackwell whose name carried weight like thunder through every terminal. Damien Blackwell, the airline's CEO, founder, billionaire, and a man known for his icy precision and merciless decisions. Harper had seen him once during a corporate safety inspection. His mere presence had reduced their senior manager to stammering apologies and nervous laughter. And now she had just struck his only child in front of nearly a dozen witnesses. Panic started crawling up her spine like a cold serpent. She turned to one of the junior flight attendants in the galley and whispered, "Do you remember the name of the unaccompanied minor in 2A?" The girl blinked, unsure. "Mason Blackwell." Harper closed her eyes for one breath that felt like an eternity, and then opened them again, her legs unsteady, her hands slick with sweat. She turned back toward the aisle. Mason now sat quietly in his seat, his little face turned toward the window, his reflection faint in the curved glass. The tablet on his lap suddenly lit up. He tapped it once, then again, and the screen connected with a video call. The name Dad blinked on the top. Harper's knees nearly buckled as she watched him lift the device, and the image of Damien Blackwell appeared, his face sharp, his hair dark and perfectly combed, his eyes cold like winter oceans. Behind him was a sleek office with digital maps, flight charts, and a muted TV playing stock reports in the background. "Hey, champ, you okay?" came the deep voice, smooth and calm, until Mason turned the tablet to face Harper and whispered, "She hit me." Harper felt the oxygen leave the cabin. Her vision narrowed. She wanted to disappear, vanish, fall through the floor, anything. But this, there was silence on the other end. Then Damien's voice returned, colder than steel, his words slow and deliberate. "Put her on the phone." Harper swallowed her pride, her fear, her regret, and leaned toward the device, her voice cracking as she said, "Sir, this is Harper from Crew ID 1941. There was a misunderstanding. I thought the child was falling, and my reaction was instinctive. It was never my intention to harm him. I swear." There was no reply for a long moment. Then, Damien's eyes narrowed, and he spoke to his son Mason. "Are you hurt?" Mason looked down at his toy, then shook his head slowly. Damien said good, and turned back to Harper. "I want you to listen carefully. You're going to stay away from him for the rest of the flight." "I will. Be on the tarmac when you land. If I find even a scratch on him, or hear that anyone else on this flight has mistreated my son, I will personally end your entire career." The screen went black. Harper took a step back as if struck, her lungs aching. With shallow breath, she looked up to see a young woman, a passenger, standing in the aisle phone, still recording the entire interaction. Harper's hands went up reflexively. "Ma'am, please stop recording. Airline policy does not permit passengers to film crew during." The woman interrupted with a cold voice. "Does airline policy permit crew to slap toddlers?" Harper froze. The captain's voice then echoed through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are passing through an area of mild turbulence. Thank you for your cooperation." Harper stumbled back into the galley, pulling the curtain closed as her hands began to shake. Other crew members looked at her wide-eyed. One asked in a whisper, "What did you do?" Harper leaned against the wall, trying to find air, trying to find answers, trying to hold back the weight of the moment that felt like it might crush her. She stared at her reflection in the galley mirror, pale, hollow cheeks, eyes rimmed with disbelief. She had always prided herself on being the calm, professional one, the crew trainer, the team lead, the reliable face of the airline. But now, she felt like a ticking clock, and she knew time was running out before the headlines came, before the video spread, before Damien Blackwell's name was attached to her mistakes. She wanted to fix it, but how do you take back a slap, seen by a dozen eyes and caught on video? How do you make a child forget the sting of a stranger's hand, especially when that child carries the name Blackwell? In seat 2A, Mason hugged his blue dinosaur tighter and watched the clouds drift by, not crying, not speaking, just holding on to something soft and safe, while the plane soared into colder skies. Her past comes crashing back. The galley curtains shifted as Harper paced inside the narrow space, every movement stiff with fear, every breath shallow and uneven. She felt like she was moving underwater, trapped in a slow, heavy current that refused to let her breathe. Her ears buzzed with the echo of Damien Blackwell's voice, and that cold blank screen still burned in her memory. Her hands kept rubbing against each other, as if she could scrub away what had happened, but nothing was working. Not logic, not denial, not even the polite masks she had trained herself to wear for years outside the curtain. Passengers still whispered. She could hear the low hum of their voices, each one slicing through her like paper cuts, and she imagined their thoughts running wild. "Did you see that? The CEO's kid imagined the lawsuit. She has finished." One of the junior flight attendants nervously peeked through the curtain, her face pale and eyes wide. "Harper, we need you for the meal service." Harper shook her head firmly. "I can't be seen near him. Just serve the others. I'll cover the rear cabin, and stay away from row 2. No exceptions." The girl nodded and slipped away quietly, leaving Harper in the tense silence of her own unraveling. She pressed her fingers to her temples, willing her heart to slow down. But then another image crept in, one she hadn't thought about in years. A small hand, a scream, a woman crying, and that same sense of dread tightening around her throat. The past never really stays buried, she thought, not when it's tied to your reflexes, to the moments you can't control, to the old scars. You swear you've moved on from 10 years ago. In a crowded supermarket, a child ran into her cart screaming at the top of his lungs. She had spun around trying to stop him from hurting himself, and her hand had connected with his arm, pulling him back to hard. The mother had screamed at her, had threatened to call the police. Harper had apologized, had broken down, had explained she had grown up around yelling. That noise triggered panic, that she didn't mean harm, that she just reacted. It was a warning sign back then, a moment she had buried and forced herself to forget during flight school, during years of smiling through turbulence and difficult passengers and crying babies. She told herself she was strong, capable, balanced. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe today just proved it. She heard a knock at the crew door and turned to see her supervisor, senior flight attendant Carla, standing with her arms folded and a look that said she already knew everything. "Harper, I need to speak with you in private now." Harper followed Carla toward the back galley. The walk felt long and heavy, as if the entire plane was leaning against her spine when they finally reached the service station. Carla turned and crossed her arms to me. She said quietly, "What happened?" Harper opened her mouth, but words failed her. She blinked slowly, trying to find where to start. I panicked. I didn't know who he was. He was climbing the seat, and I thought he would fall, and I reacted too fast. It wasn't violent. It was more of a tap, I swear, but I saw his face after, and I knew it was wrong. Carla sighed and looked toward the closed curtain at the front. "He called his father, didn't he?" Harper nodded once. Slowly, Carla didn't speak right away. Instead, she pulled out her work tablet and scrolled through the flight manifest. She showed the screen to Harper. "Is this the child?" Harper nodded again. "This isn't just bad." Carla said, "This is catastrophic. This isn't someone who'll file a complaint. And wait, this is Damien Blackwell. You might be on a blacklist by the time we land." Harper clenched her fists. "I know. I ruined everything." Carla stared at her for a moment, then softened. "Listen, we all make mistakes, and passengers can be unpredictable, but there is one thing you never ever do. You never put your hands on a child, especially a child flying alone, especially a child who could own the airline." Harper lowered her gaze. I was trying to help Carla. Didn't reply. She just turned the tablet off and put it back in her pouch. "You'll need to file an incident report when we land, and they'll decide what happens next. Until then, stay in the back, keep quiet, and pray someone else goes viral this week." Harper returned to the galley and leaned against the wall again, her eyes burning not just from fear, but from something deeper, the realization that one moment, one flash of old panic had unraveled her entire career. She had given everything to this job, missed birthdays, lost relationships, moved cities, just to wear that uniform, and now all of it was slipping through her fingers back in first class. Mason was quiet again, sipping juice from a plastic cup, his little feet swinging off the seat, his dinosaur tucked safely under one arm. The video call had ended, but the damage was done. One of the flight attendants came by offering him more snacks and a coloring book, but he shook his head gently. She smiled and backed away, unsure what else to do. The other passengers looked at him with curiosity. Now some with sympathy, some with judgment, but none spoke to him directly. Halfway through the flight, the captain made another announcement that they would be landing on schedule in 2 hours. Harper listened from the crew seat near the emergency exit, her heart racing with each passing minute, every second bringing her closer to the ground, closer to facing Damien Blackwell in person. The thought of him waiting at the gate, his eyes cold, his words precise, filled her with a dread that felt almost physical. She imagined the meeting, imagined standing in front of him, trying to explain her side, trying to protect the last shred of her dignity, but deep down she knew it. It wouldn't matter. He had power, influence, reputation, and the video likely already circulating the internet. She didn't stand a chance in the last hour of the flight. Harper closed her eyes and tried to remember her own childhood, the screaming, the fights, the broken glass, the way she used to flinch at raised voices. Maybe that's why she had overreacted today. Maybe seeing a child climbing and yelling triggered something buried and raw and ugly. Maybe she wasn't the perfect, calm professional after all. Maybe she was just someone trying to survive her own history. In the sky, she opened her eyes again as Carla returned with a message. "Blackwell's team just called. They'll be waiting at gate 11 when we land. You are not to disembark until after the passengers. They want a word." Harper nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She wanted to run, she wanted to hide, but all she could do was sit and wait as the world she had built began to fall apart, piece by piece. The wheels of the plane finally touched down, and the soft bump of landing felt like a final verdict. The engine slowed, the seatbelt signs chimed, and the doors opened to the jet bridge. Harper sat frozen as the first-class passengers slowly gathered their belongings and disembarked. Mason was escorted off first by a ground agent, who smiled kindly and took his tiny hand, leading him down the aisle. He didn't look back, not once. Harper didn't blame him when the last passenger was gone. Carla returned and nodded. "It's time." Harper stood slowly, her knees shaking as she followed Carla down the aisle toward the open door, where 2 men in dark suits and earpieces waited silently. Behind them stood Damien Blackwell, arms crossed, sunglasses still on despite being indoors. His presence radiated command and danger like a storm waiting to strike. Harper stepped off the plane, her breath trembling, her heart thudding louder than the engines ever had. She knew this was not just the end of a flight, it was the beginning of a reckoning. The CEO's verdict. Harper stood at the edge of the jet bridge, her shoes firmly planted, but her soul dangling by a thread. The moment her eyes met Damien Blackwell's, she felt the full weight of everything that had gone wrong, everything she had built over the years. Every mile flown, every sacrifice made, all of it now dangling in front of the one man who had the power to erase it all. With a single command, the two men in suits said nothing. They only stepped aside, allowing Damien to walk forward with a posture so still it felt unnatural, like a statue carved from ice and stone. Harper tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it clung to her like a noose. She wanted to speak, to explain, to fall on her knees if she had to, but he lifted one hand, not violently, not angrily, just enough to stop her before a word came out. "Come with me," he said without looking back. Harper followed him down the terminal, every step louder than the last, the sound of her heartbeat competing with the hum of the airport. The weight of stairs, real or imagined, pressing into her skin. People moved out of the way as they passed, as if instinctively, sensing that something serious was happening and no one wanted to be near it. They stopped in a private conference room just past gate 12. The glass walls frosted over, the lighting cool and professional. There was a small round table, 2 chairs, and silence. Damien finally turned to face her and removed his sunglasses. His eyes were sharp and unreadable, like a locked vault of emotions she could not open. "Sit," he said. She obeyed without a word, folding her hands tightly in her lap like a child awaiting punishment in a principal's office. He sat across from her, arms resting on the table, fingers laced as he stared. "You're Harper Reynolds," he said slowly. "Crew, ID 1941, senior cabin attendant, 10 years of service, flight lead trainer, fluent in 3 languages, recognized by the airline for service excellence 2 years ago, for diffusing a violent passenger situation in mid-air." Harper blinked, unsure how to respond. He continued, "And you slapped my son?" Her throat tightened again. She wanted to defend herself, to cry out that it was a mistake, that it was not what it looked like, that she panicked because of old scars that never truly healed, but she knew excuses would sound like noise to a man like this, so she said the truth. "Yes, I did, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." His eyes narrowed. He was alone. He was scared. He was playing, and you struck him in front of half the cabin. "That's not a lapse in judgment. That's an act of aggression against a child." Her voice broke as she replied, "I didn't mean to hurt him. I swear I didn't even register who he was. I just saw him climbing, and I thought he was about to fall, and I reacted without thinking." He stared for a long moment, his eyes finally shifting just slightly, as if assessing something deeper than words. He asked, "Do you have children?" Harper shook her head. "Not yet, no." He leaned back in his chair slowly. "Then, let me tell you something, Harper. When your child is 4 years old and flying alone on a plane, you are trusting the airline to treat them like royalty, not just because I own it, but because children are vulnerable. They have no defense. They are the purest and easiest to damage." She nodded, her eyes burning. "I know I failed him. I failed you, and I failed myself." He watched her quietly, then asked, "Have you ever had a disciplinary issue before?" "No." She said, "I have never harmed a passenger. I have always followed procedure, except today." He stood then, pacing slowly, as if weighing something heavier than just her job, maybe her character, maybe something more. "Do you know how many threats I get a week, Harper? How many lawsuits? How many enemies want to destroy my name, my company, my family? That little boy is my life, and the only reason I let him fly alone is because I trusted my people. I trusted my system, and today you cracked." The voice trembled. "I know, I broke your trust, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, let me explain something, and I ask you to hear me, not as a CEO, but as a human being." He stopped walking and looked at her, saying, "You have 2 minutes." She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "When I was younger, I was raised in a violent home. I learned to read the danger in people's voices and movements. Long before I could read books, loud noises still rattle me. Screaming children don't just annoy me, they trigger something in my nervous system that makes me panic. But I have spent years fighting that. I became a flight attendant because I believed in creating safety for others, and in helping people get from chaos to calm. It was the one space I thought I could master, but when Mason jumped on the seat and screamed, I froze. It wasn't rage, it wasn't hate, it was a reflex, one I wish I could tear out of my soul." Damien said nothing. She continued, "I am not proud of it. I have spent years in therapy trying to undo what was wired into me. I didn't hit him in anger. I panicked. I moved to stop what I thought was danger, and the moment I saw his face, I knew I had done something terrible. I wanted to take it back instantly, but it was too late. She paused, her voice cracking. Please, know that I would never intentionally harm any child, not yours, not anyone's, and I accept whatever consequences you believe I deserved. Damien returned to his seat slowly, his hands once again folded on the table, his face less sharp, but still unreadable. The door opened slightly, and his assistant leaned in, whispering something. He nodded, then turned back to Harper. You know what Mason said to me after the call? She shook her head. He said she looked scared. Too. Harper looked down, her fingers twitching. He's observant like his mother, Damien said, his voice softer, and I believe him more than I believe video clips or public outrage. Harper looked up, her eyes locking with his. Not firing you yet, he said. She blinked, stunned by the words. Putting you on immediate suspension pending investigation, and I'm assigning a child psychologist to interview Mason. Upon landing, if he says he feels unsafe around you, if he cries when your name is mentioned, if he flinches at your photo, you're done. No arbitration, no appeal. But if he says you scared him, and that's all, then maybe, just maybe, you'll return to work under strict probation and mandatory counseling. Harper's breath finally returned for the first time in hours. Thank you, she said, softly. Don't thank me yet, he replied. This is not mercy, it's accountability, and I expect you to rebuild the trust you shattered, and you do not get a second chance after this. She nodded. Yes, I understand. Fully. He stood again, the conversation clearly over. She followed him out of the room and watched as he met his son in the waiting lounge. Mason smiled and ran into his arms. Damien scooped him up, held him close, and whispered something into his ear. Mason looked at Harper for a second, just one glance, and then returned to resting his head on his father's shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't hatred either, and in that moment Harper knew she had been given a rare thing, not a free pass, not a clean slate, but a chance to face the mirror and do something with the reflection staring back at her, the weight of a child's truth. The days that followed felt like walking through fog, where every step was uncertain, and every sound was muffled by the weight pressing down on her. Harper sat alone in her apartment, the uniform she once wore with pride now hanging in a garment bag behind her door, untouched since the day she landed. Her fingers nervously fidgeted with the rim of her coffee mug, though the coffee inside had long gone cold. The airline had placed her on official suspension pending investigation, and she had been ordered not to speak publicly, not to speak to press, not to speak to staff, not to speak to anyone connected with the Blackwell family, including the child, whose quiet words had sparked the entire storm. Her phone had been flooded with messages, some supportive, some venomous, but she read none of them. She just sat by the window each morning, staring at the sky, watching planes slice through clouds, wondering if she would ever be in one again. She had spent years flying across oceans, comforting passengers through turbulence, holding hands during emergency landings, assisting mothers with sick babies, managing panicked flyers, but none of it seemed to matter. Now, not after one mistake, not after one child had flinched and looked away. The airline's internal review team had already contacted her requesting an in-person statement, which she gave with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes. She had told them everything from her childhood to the moment her fingers touched Mason's face, and every terrifying second after she had not hidden from the truth, not softened it. She had spoken with the honesty of someone who had already sentenced herself long before others ever could, but she still didn't know what Mason had said, not the full truth. She didn't know if his father had turned against her completely, or if the child's small voice had found space for mercy. She lived each day between dread and hope, torn between preparing for unemployment or redemption, and then came the letter, not by email or post, but by courier. A thick envelope sealed with the Blackwell family crest inside was a single sheet of parchment, not printed, not typed, handwritten in ink with careful strokes that mirrored the calm power of the man who had signed it. Harper, my son has been seen by a licensed child trauma therapist, whose report I have read in full and discussed in depth. Mason stated that he felt startled and confused, but not threatened. He said you looked afraid, not angry, and that you did not yell or curse. He said you apologized and tried to comfort him. His exact words were, she was like a dog who was hit too many times and thought I was going to bite her. That image has stayed with me as a father. I will never tolerate harm to my child. And if I believed you acted with cruelty, I would have ended your career immediately, and perhaps worse. But what I see now is someone who has been fighting her own demons, someone who forgot for 1 second who she had become and slipped into who she used to be. Believe in accountability, but I also believe in rehabilitation. I am offering you a choice: return to the airline under a new mentorship program I am developing for staff who have experienced trauma in their own lives. You will not return as lead. You will shadow under another senior attendant and undergo therapy paid for by the airline and approved by me personally. If after 6 months you demonstrate growth, honesty, and emotional stability, you will be reinstated fully. You decline the offer, your resignation will be accepted without prejudice, and your record will show voluntary withdrawal. No black mark, no media release, no further damage to your name. You have 48 hours to decide it. Blackwell Harper. Read the letter again and again, each word hitting her in ways she did not expect. Not mercy, not punishment, but something between, something human, something terrifying, something healing. She walked to the mirror slowly. Her reflection stared back, pale, tired, older than it should have been, but not broken, not anymore. She touched the glass lightly, then turned and reached for her phone. She dialed the number provided in the envelope and confirmed she would accept the offer the next week. Harper reported to the airline's training facility in uniform, but without the stripes of seniority on her shoulders. She was met by a woman named Alina, a calm presence who had flown longer than Harper had been alive. Alina said nothing about the scandal made. No mention of Mason Blackwell, simply handed her a schedule and said, "Let's see if your wings still remember how to fly." They worked side by side on short domestic flights. Harper took drink orders, smiled at passengers, explained safety procedures, lifted bags and tied oxygen masks in demonstrations. She stayed quiet, but alert eyes, scanning every moment, every child, every parent, every risk, her hands steadier. Now her voice softer, but more rooted, like a tree, once shaken by wind, learning again how to stand tall between flights. She met weekly with Dr. Hansen, the airline-approved therapist, a soft-spoken man who asked hard questions and never looked away. When she cried, he walked her back through the moments of childhood she had locked away, the screams, the fists, the slammed doors, and how they taught her to react fast, defend fast, flinch fast. He helped her name the terror that lived inside her, the part she never invited but had carried into the sky anyway. In one session he asked her, "Do you think the sky is where you go to run away or to feel safe?" She didn't answer then, but she thought about it every night. 3 months into the program, she was assigned a flight to Denver with Alina watching from 2 rows back. Midway through the flight, a toddler began crying uncontrollably, the mother overwhelmed, trying to calm him but losing patience fast. Harper walked over, knelt down, and gently handed the boy a napkin folded like a bird, then slowly pulled her own dinosaur plush from her pocket, one she had bought after that day to remind her always of Mason. The boy blinked, then smiled, hugging the toy as his cries faded. Harper sat beside him for 5 minutes, letting the mother breathe. When the plane landed, the mother hugged her, whispered thank you, and Harper realized her hands hadn't shaken once that night. Alina pulled her aside and said quietly, "I think you're ready." The next morning her phone rang. The airline had reinstated her full status and invited her to a small private ceremony for staff appreciation. No cameras, no headlines, just one event room, one long table, and 15 people who had been through fire and come out stronger. At the end of the table sat Damian Blackwell with Mason on his lap, the boy no longer distant or confused, just smiling. When Harper approached, Mason looked up and said, in a small voice, "You look better now." She knelt down, tears quietly escaping, and said, "I feel better now." Damian extended his hand and said, "Welcome back, Miss Reynolds." Harper shook it, and in that moment she felt something she had not felt in years. Not relief, not pride, but peace, because forgiveness had not erased her mistake, but it had given her the chance to be more than it had. Sometimes the sky is not just a place to fly. Sometimes it is where you finally come home. Turbulence returns at 35,000 feet. The clouds outside the aircraft window shifted like slow waves across a quiet ocean, while Harper stood calmly in the galley, organizing the trays and checking her lists. Her posture was tall, her expression composed, but underneath her skin something inside her stirred. The schedule today was heavy with important passengers, executives, journalists, to board members, and above all Mason Blackwell. and his father were flying again. In her carrot had been nearly a year since the incident, and Harper had completed every part of her recovery, training, every therapy session, every evaluation, and she had returned to the skies with more clarity than she ever had before, but this flight felt different. It felt like something was circling her. Something waiting. Mason, now 5 years old, had taken seat 1, clutching his new blue backpack and a sketchpad in his lap. He looked more confident, more curious, and had already greeted her with a small grin. When boarding, she had responded with the same smile and a soft welcome aboard. "Mason, thank you for flying with us again," and he had nodded, as if they shared an unspoken understanding between people who had seen each other at their worst and still chosen to meet again with open eyes. Damien was seated a few rows back, quietly working on his tablet, surrounded by a buffer of empty seats. His presence still carried that silent gravity, but this time, Harper felt no fear, just awareness and a deep sense of responsibility that was not driven by panic, but by choice. 2 hours into the flight, the turbulence began soft at first, then sharper. The plane rocked gently, and passengers held their drinks a little tighter. Harper moved down the aisle, calmly offering reassurance, but something in her gut whispered louder than the seatbelt chime. Something was wrong. She had flown through storms before, through sudden drops and air pockets, but this was not the sky. This was something else. As she entered the galley to grab extra blankets, a voice stopped her. A passenger in row 3 had pressed the call button. Harper approached and smiled, but her expression shifted when she recognized the face. The woman had sharp eyes, tight lips, and a familiar voice that struck a nerve deep in Harper's memory. "Well," the woman said softly, still flying. "I see." Harper blinked for a moment, trying to place her until the image hit her like a punch through the chest. The supermarket, the screaming child, the accusation. It was the mother from all those years ago. She had grown older, but her glare had not faded. "I didn't recognize you at first," the woman said, with a cold smirk, "but your voice gave it away. I never forget the voice of someone who manhandled my son in public." Harper swallowed hard, her hands gripping the service cart just slightly. "That was a long time ago," Harper said quietly. "I apologized back then, and I was wrong, but I have spent years trying to make it right." The woman leaned forward, her tone sharp and bitter. "You should not be allowed near children then or now. Maybe people like you never really change, no matter what bad you where." Passengers nearby turned their heads, some curious, some confused. Harper felt their eyes crawling over her again, judging again, slicing into her again. Her breath caught for just a moment, the same weight, returning the same fear, but this time, something held her up. Not pride, not stubbornness, but truth. She looked at the woman and said calmly, "I am sorry for what happened back then, and I understand your anger, but I am not that same person anymore. And if you truly believe people cannot grow, then perhaps it is not me who is still stuck in the past." The woman sneered and looked away, but the damage had already begun. Whispers in the row behind, quiet murmurs in the front, suspicion beginning to spread through the cabin. Like stood from his seat and walked slowly down the aisle, sensing the shift in atmosphere. His eyes scanned Harper, then the woman, then the quiet unrest building. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. The woman looked up and said, with a bitter tone, "Yes, there is. This stewardess has a record of harming children, including mine. She should not be near your son." Mason stood up in his seat, turning round, his little face concerned. "What is going on?" he asked Harper. "Okay." Harper stood frozen, caught in a moment she could not escape again. A child watching again, a man with power waiting again, strangers deciding who she was based on a single echo from her past. But then Mason walked down the aisle, past the startled passengers, and took her hand gently, saying, "She is not mean. She helps. She helped me, and my dad trusts her." The woman tried to protest, but Damien raised a hand, stopping her with nothing more than a glance. He looked at Harper directly, then spoke loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "My son is not afraid of her, and neither am I. And if you have a complaint, I suggest you file it through proper legal channels, instead of disrupting my flight with outdated stories and false outrage." The woman blinked, stunned, then looked down and said nothing more. Harper bent down to Mason and whispered, "Thank you," and Mason just smiled, saying, "You told me once that even scared people can be brave. Now you are brave." She felt tears building but did not let them fall. Not yet. She stood upright, returned to the galley and continued her duties. As the turbulence slowly faded, the sky cleared and calm returned to the cabin. Later, as passengers prepared for descent, Damien approached her near the exit door, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "That was not easy," he said, "and I imagine that old wound still stings." She nodded slightly. "But I survived it, and I did not run." He nodded and looked out the small window at the fading light outside. "You have done more than prove yourself, Harper," he said. "You have reminded me that resilience is not about being unbreakable. It is about healing and still showing up." She smiled at him, and for the first time she felt like she could breathe freely, without guilt, without fear. As the plane touched down, Harper realized this flight had not just been another leg of a journey. It had been her quiet victory, her final test, her step into a life not defined by one mistake, but by every choice. After the sky, after the storm weeks passed since that flight, and yet Harper still remembered every breath of it, every step down the aisle, every word spoken, and every eye that had watched her with either doubt or belief. Since then, something in her had shifted, not just the way she moved, but the way she saw herself. She had flown dozens of routes, interacted with hundreds of passengers, but none left a deeper mark than the boy who once feared her and later defended her with more courage than most adults could summon. Her journey with the airline was now not just a job, it had become a living mirror of who she was, who she had been, and who she was becoming. Each flight a page, each moment a choice, each encounter a chance to either run or rise. On a crisp autumn morning, Harper was called into the regional headquarters, a place she had entered only once before during the darkest hours of her career. This time the sun was out, and she walked with a steady pace, wearing her uniform, not like a shield, but like a second skin, earned through fire and time. Inside, she was greeted by a familiar assistant, who led her down a hall of frosted glass walls and clean wooden panels into a conference room with a view of the runway below, and at the far end stood Damien Blackwell, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in a simple black shirt, his posture more relaxed, his eyes no longer cold. He gestured to a chair across from him, and waited until she sat. "You look more at ease today," he said, and she smiled. "Because I am." He nodded, and placed a folder on the table before her. Inside were documents, not of suspension, not of reprimand, but of invitation. "You have completed your program with full commendation," he said. "Your evaluations show progress beyond our expectations, and your passengers now rate you as one of the most compassionate crew members they encounter. That is not a small recovery, Miss Reynolds." She took the folder and opened it, slowly seeing her name at the top of a new initiative, one that did not yet exist, one that was still being shaped. "We are launching a new in-flight trauma response program," he continued, "designed to train staff not just in safety and comfort, but in recognizing emotional triggers in passengers and in themselves. I want you to lead it as head of emotional preparedness and staff recovery." Harper looked up, stunned, unsure if she had heard him right. "You want me to lead this?" she asked. "After all that happened?" Damien leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I do, because you lived it. You faced it, you owned it, and you transformed it. We do not need perfect people, we need honest ones. We need people who know that healing is not linear, that strength is not about hiding weakness." She blinked, and for a moment words failed her. Then slowly she nodded. "I will do it. I will give everything I have." He smiled faintly. "I know you will." Before she left, he added one more thing. "Talks about you often. He remembers the dinosaur, the apology, the way you held yourself even when the world turned against you. He says you were like the sky, calm above the storm, but still shaped by it." Harper left the building with the papers clutched tightly in her hand, and a heart that felt lighter than it had in years. She stood outside the terminal for a long moment, watching the planes lift into the blue, stretching far beyond the horizon, and for the first time in her life, she did not just envy their flight, she understood it. 2 months later, Harper stood before a room of newly hired flight attendants, sharing her story without shame, without trembling. She spoke of the slap, the fall, the climb back. She told them what no manual ever does, that fear is real, that mistakes can haunt you, that survival is not enough unless you turn it into growth. She ended the session with words she had once heard from a child, whose innocence had changed her life. "Sometimes scared people can be brave, too." And the room was silent, not from judgment, but from respect. Later that day, during a long-haul flight, Harper moved through the cabin with quiet confidence, assisting a mother whose toddler had dropped a juice, Boxed under the seat, the child looked up at her nervously, unsure, and Harper smiled, knelt down and handed him a new one, along with a folded paper plane she had made earlier. The boy grinned, and his mother whispered thank you with genuine relief in her eyes. Harper stood again and looked around the cabin, the quiet hum of engines, the soft rustle of blankets, the peace of people in transit. She thought back to that moment, that slap, that stare, that cold call with the man she thought would end her life, and instead gave her a new one. She thought of the woman who had tried to drag her back into shame, and how she had stayed standing not because she forgot her past, but because she had finally accepted it. She thought of Mason, the little boy who once looked at her with fear, and later held her hand in front of a crowd and told the truth. She had once believed her scars made her weak. Now she knew they were part of her armor, not to hide, but to reveal what healing really looks like. The sky outside the window burned gold as the sun began to set, and Harper took a deep breath, letting it fill her completely. She no longer flew to escape. She no longer feared the turbulence inside her. She flew to carry stories, to protect journeys, to remind others and herself that no matter how high you fall, you can still rise higher, because true redemption does not erase the past. It transforms it into something that serves the future. And in that endless stretch of clouds and courage, Harper Reynolds had found her way home. The end.